Hi, I'm Joe Saunders of Miniature Landscape Hobbies. In this episode, we're going to celebrate the launch of the new Warsaw Pact for Team Yankee book by building some diorama quality terrain using some of the excellent pieces by Gale Force 9. I've been fortunate to have an excellent relationship with Battlefront Miniatures. Every time they launch a new book, I prepare a couple of new videos to showcase how to maximize the use of their Battlefield in the Box products for your own games table. The Warsaw Pact Forces for Team Yankee have now come out, so it's time to get to work. For this build, they were kind enough to send me the municipal building, car parks, and as a special bonus, the Special Order large sign. All of these will make great and characterful subjects. Most Battlefield in the Box items come pre-painted and look great going straight on the games table. My approach, though, is different. I've always favored enhancing all of my terrain to make it visually interesting and to make it fit in with my own spread. In this episode, I'm going to use the excellent municipal building as a base to make diorama quality terrain for my new Warsaw Pact forces to fight over. Sit back and check out my process. As always, I started with a plan. I put the municipal building and the car parks down on a sheet of foam core and measured around them. I wanted to lay out how the bases would be created up front. I knew I wanted a little park section beside the municipal building, so I made it fairly large, and I also set it up so that the car park section would butt up against the municipal building itself to give it a proper look. When this was done, I then got out my mat cutter and went ahead and cut both sections out. Make sure you've got a fresh knife blade for this, because it'll give you a lot better cut. With these parts cut out, I then set the car park aside and went to work on the municipal building first. I drew on the foam core where the building would be positioned and where I would put my gardens and other features. When that was done, I drew on a 1 cm by 1 cm square grid into the surface of the foam core. I scored it into place with a pen so that it would create some relief in the surface itself. Since naturalized areas are almost never perfectly flat, I took out some foam core cutoffs and peeled the top layer of paper off of them. Then I cut them to roughly fit the shape of the flower beds and sanded them down, rounding off the edges with a sanding sponge. With these built, I then installed them with hot glue. Now was the right time to add the grit to the model, so I spread down some Mod Podge that I had mixed with acrylic black paint and sprinkled over top of it a mix of about 80% sand and about 20% kitty litter. After I had done this, I then went ahead and soaked the whole thing with rubbing alcohol and applied more watered down Mod Podge over top of that. I left this overnight to dry, and then when it was done, I took out my airbrush and sprayed everything down with a black primer coat. Moving to sand yellow, I airbrush a layer of this into the middle of each panel on the building. I make sure to feather it out towards the edges to let some of the black undercoat shine through to imply depth. When that's done, I then got out aged white and repeated the process, again focusing a little more heavily towards the inside of each wall section. When this had dried, I could add a final highlight here, so I got out ivory and dry brushed it on. The brickwork was next, so I got out Hull Red and Light Rust. I mixed it together 50-50 and painted this on over all the brick columns. When this was dry, I then took out a little more light rust, mixed it 50-50 with deck tan, and dry brushed this over the top of the brickwork. Things were now looking pretty good, so I moved on to the door. This got painted with 2 coats of old wood, and then I dry brushed it with deck tan to provide a quick highlight. Now I was at a part in these projects that, honestly, I really dread, and that's the windows. Preparing windows always requires a lot of different layering techniques and a really steady hand. To make it a little easier on myself, I took out a bottle of liquid mask and painted it over top of the window frames. This would prevent me from slopping my colors accidentally onto the already painted portions of the model. Once the mask was dried, I then took out various shades of the color blue. I worked them into the windows, working from darkest to lightest, and finished off by putting a dot of white in opposite corners of the window frame to imply glints. Now, this is a pretty involved process, and I don't really want to detail the whole thing here. It's not a difficult procedure, but it is lengthy and has quite a few steps. Click the link up above in order to see my previous video on the process if you want to learn a little bit more about how to paint windows. With the windows complete, I pulled out a brush that had stiff bristles and that was completely dry. I flicked it back and forth over the surface of the liquid mask until it came off. That rounded off this portion of the model, and all I needed to do was turn my attention to the roof. Fortunately, a lot of the pre-painted components of the battlefield and the box models already look really great, and I thought the shingles on the roof looked fine on their own. So I just gave them a quick dry brush of deck tan to renew the colors a little bit, and with that the building was done. Now I could turn my attention to the pavement itself. I got out my airbrush, loaded it with dark gall gray, and carefully airbrushed it over the top of all the paver tiles I had sculpted. I used a piece of cardboard and stood it between the painted portions of the building and the pavers to make sure that I didn't get any overspray on my already carefully painted building. As is characteristic for my method for building terrain, now started the dry brushing. A lot of dry brushing. I went back over the dark gall gray with some light gray, and I also went over the earth areas with a dark brown and several earth tones highlighting up to tan. When that was done, I was pretty confident it was time to get down to work with the shading. First, I decided though I needed to protect my initial layers. So I got out some satin varnish and sprayed 2 solid coats down over top of everything, the building and the base included. The problem with highlighting using a lot of dry brushing is that it tends to wash things out and it kills your contrast. The way to fix this, of course, is to apply some shading. In this case, I wanted to do it quickly, so I decided to rely on the oil wash method. This is both a fairly fast method and a very effective one. I got out some black oil paint and some dark brown oil paint and mixed them roughly 50-50. Then I added mineral spirit thinner to the mix until everything flowed and gave me a nice translucent look. Taking out a brush, I then went and washed this across the surface of both the building and the stone pavers. The lack of surface tension from adding thinner into the mix helps draw the wash into the crevices and create depth. Once I had put the wash down, I let it dry for about 20 minutes. I then took out a makeup sponge and carefully ran it over all of the open areas that didn't have crevices or cracks where I wanted the wash to accumulate. Oil paints take longer than acrylics to dry, so now I left this alone for a couple hours. When the oil paints had set, I could finally start work on one of my favorite parts, the landscaping. I got out some Mod Podge and painted it over the top of any of the areas that I thought should be naturalized. I left a border around the trail at the side of the municipal building so it could function as a flower bed. Over top of this Mod Podge, I then went ahead and sprinkled some static grass from a static grass applicator. I picked a fairly rich green color because I wanted this lawn to look healthy. When that was all down, I then went over everything with a thin coat of hairspray. This will help seal stuff down better and imparts a slight tacky texture to the surface. On top of the hairspray, I then went and sprinkled on a few more different types of grass and some oregano to imply deadfall on the lawn. With this down, I then locked it in with yet another layer of hairspray. Going to my handy box of landscaping supplies, I glued down some plants and flowers where I set up the flower beds. I also add a couple trees here and there. To help create the impression that this garden area was in fact inhabited by people, I superglued down a fountain, a couple of benches, and a garbage can. These are HO scale supplies for model trains, but HO scale at 187 is pretty close to Flames of War and Team Yankee scale at 1/100, so I thought it gave the right impression. Now I could add just a little bit more weathering. I got out some dry pigments, and with a stiff bristled brush that was completely dry, I brushed them into the corners, around the gardens, and anywhere I thought accumulated dirt or dust might look good. Because the surface of the model had previously been sprayed by hairspray, it created a bit of a tacky effect, which held the pigments in place, but still allowed me to adjust them by running the brush over them. To cap off the weathering effects, I got out some green, brown, and rust tone weathering pencils, wet them slightly, and drew streaks on the side of the building. Then, with a slightly moistened square tip brush, I blended these out carefully. Once the weathering pencils had dried, I then once more went back to some varnish, in this case matte varnish, and I sprayed 2 coats over the whole base. I made sure that the model was sealed to protect it from the inevitable wear and tear of gameplay. And with that, this project was done. Miniature Landscape Hobbies is your source for miniature, terrain building, and diorama content, and we can't do it without your support. We want to build a community to ensure that the wonderful art of building a miniature is accessible to everybody. To participate, please consider joining on Patreon. For $4 a month, our Patreon members benefit from 10% off at Joe Saunders Terrain in the Etsy store, 5% off paints and hobby supplies at Torchlight Games, free access to STL files, a mention in our credits, and early access to our videos. Please check it out and consider joining. That's it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed making it. Please remember to subscribe, press the bell button so you get immediate notification on our videos, and until next time, remember to keep building life in miniature.